Hi, my name is Michael Jabbara, and I lead the global strategy and operations team for the risk function within Visa. My role really centers around looking at how the payment landscape is evolving, what new trends are shaping it from a security perspective, and then ensuring that Visa and its ecosystem partners have the right technology, the right analytics, and the right expertise to navigate the changing environment to make sure that we are continuing to deliver the most seamless and secure payment experience possible. And as you can imagine, the past 12 months have been an incredibly exciting, transformative, and disruptive time when thinking about how to deliver that optimal digitized experience while managing risk in a robust and holistic way. So I'll walk you through some of my thoughts on the pandemic, ways to manage that, and a potential framework for you to leverage in your respective organizations to think about managing the digital experience in these very unprecedented times, to use the word one more time. And so COVID-19, I think, was a bit of a wake-up call to a lot of the organizations that we work with in terms of the importance of delivering services digitally to consumers whose needs and expectations rapidly changed. Essentially, overnight, digital transformation became a business imperative, and it was what separated entities that were able to survive and maybe even thrive in the pandemic to those who were left behind. And as a result, we saw in almost a matter of days, business priorities shift to deal with this rapidly evolving environment. One of the most interesting things was really around the rapid change in consumer behavior that we saw. It was this great leap forward in terms of how people made payments and interacted with their service providers. If you look at the middle of the pandemic, we had a situation where the payment volume in the physical channel had actually decreased by about 20%, while the payment volume in digital channels had increased by about 40% when you exclude travel. That was during the pandemic. Over time, as we're seeing the signs of recovery and a return to normal, some of that mix has changed a little bit, but we're still seeing digital engagement at historic highs. So more recently, we're seeing payment volume in the physical channel about break even year over year, while the digital channel is still experiencing growth of about 30%, again, when you exclude travel. So these digital interactions are really becoming the norm. And it is imperative on us to think about what is that security foundation to ensure that we are meeting our consumers where they expect us to be. And so given these rapidly changing consumer expectations, as well as the increasing sophistication of fraudsters that we're seeing in the landscape today, it's not really surprising that many organizations foresee risk management becoming increasingly complex over the next couple of years. I myself personally think that despite all the change that we've seen over the last 12 months, the amount of disruption and transformation over the next 12 to 18 months will far outweigh that, simply as we manage to navigate this return to normalcy. And we've actually seen in a study that Visa had conducted with Forrester that about 80% of companies are going to be increasingly focused on risk management over the next couple of years, exactly just to navigate that change. The other 20%, I suppose, we're going to be taking a bit of a laissez-faire approach and just hoping for the best, which I certainly don't recommend on a personal note. And that's especially true because we saw how the conditions of the pandemic created this really ideal environment for fraudsters to thrive. So between the rapid digitization of everyday interactions and experiences that we deliver to consumers, and then the social, economic, and political unrest that coincided with the pandemic, it really was an environment that allowed new organized and innovative fraud schemes to come to the forefront, and in a way, kind of almost act as a headwind to this massive digital transformation that we had been experiencing. And I want to spend a little bit of time just kind of talking through some of these kind of new fraud schemes, or not exactly new, but some of these fraud schemes that are top of mind for us. I think most of you are pretty familiar with these, but I want to give you a perspective on what we're seeing from the Visa side, as well as some key takeaways in this area. And the first one is really around kind of e-commerce skimming. So during the pandemic, we saw this increase in the injection of malware in the websites of commercial and service providers everywhere. And that led to a significant increase in the number of at-risk accounts that were compromised through that channel. As you can see, over 85% of those alerts come from the digital channel, kind of showing the focus shifting for fraudsters as well. And the other interesting takeaway here is that the level of sophistication of these skimming variants has also increased over time, where now we're seeing their ability to kind of hide from detection from developer tools or self-delete to prevent that detection once they've successfully exfiltrated the sensitive payment data. So there's kind of this arms race that's happening in the space that we're always trying to get ahead of. The second is around social engineering, which has been obviously around for quite a while. But what I thought was really interesting is kind of how it evolved as the pandemic went on. So what we saw at the beginning in that February to April timeframe is this proliferation of fake merchant websites that popped up selling fake COVID cures, fake tests, respirators, and solicited payments for goods and services that were never delivered. And then we saw this transition towards more phishing and vishing attacks that were aiming to solicit sensitive financial services information by pretending to be the bank that you have a relationship with. And these attacks weren't kind of as generic as what we had seen previously. The fraudsters had taken the time to research the financial institution that their targeted victims had banked with and manipulated their caller ID so that they seem as if they were a legitimate institution. And that kind of resulted in a whole host of kind of fraud losses for some of these clients. And then more recently, kind of that next iteration of that next phase was really centered around unemployment fraud and economic disbursement fraud, where we're seeing fraudsters take compromised sensitive data that they purchase on the dark web and cobble together identities to siphon off some of these economic funds and really test out and exploit the vulnerabilities that we see in state unemployment systems and in our disbursement systems. The third is really around kind of ransomware. Kind of the interesting takeaway here that we had over the pandemic was the increasing targeting of financial institutions, especially those that were medium or in the long tail. And we saw at least a couple of instances in which these ransomware attacks specifically targeted sensitive card data, data that was then later turning up in the dark web for sale. So kind of in our mind, kind of ransomware attacks on financial institutions are very much equivalent to data breaches, where that account information now has to be regenerated to prevent further losses downstream. Enumeration attacks are also kind of this interesting attack vector that we've been focused on more recently. As you can see by the graph, in the onset of the pandemic, we had seen this significant increase in the number of enumerated transactions. It was about 20% year over year or so. And then over time, that trend has modulated or plateaued a bit. And I think part of the reason for that is that they're kind of fairly inefficient kind of method of fraud. While these enumerated transactions were increasing, the fraud that's associated with the enumerated accounts was actually decreasing over time. And so the fraudsters were not effective in actually monetizing these credentials through this attack vector. Having said that, however, we're still seeing kind of a tremendous amount of operational costs that are being imposed through these attacks. Our data, for instance, shows that for a merchant who suffered an enumeration attack, their approval rate doesn't return to its pre-attack level until 2 months after the attack had been stopped. So kind of imagine the revenue and sales losses that these merchants kind of endure as a result of this. And this is another reason why we're continuing to focus on this vector quite a bit. And then the final one is really around nation-backed threat actors. Kind of hostile regimes have felt the fiscal strain of the COVID pandemic pretty significantly. And as the pandemic had began, we had seen increasing alerts that some of these groups were going to be targeting financial institutions through cash-out attacks. Fortunately, that hasn't really come to fruition. But we posit that the reason for that is likely due to them targeting cryptocurrency-related schemes instead as a way of generating illicit revenues. And so with kind of these types of threat vectors coming to the forefront during the pandemic and coupled with very dynamic and volatile spending patterns, kind of there was this expectation that we're going to be experiencing a pretty significant spike in the overall fraud volume as a result. But thankfully, what we actually had been witnessing was that the overall fraud volume actually decreased by about 4% year over year. And I think part of that was driven by our ability to shift a lot of the merchants that were primarily focused on the physical channel, like wholesale clubs and grocery stores and pharmacies, to the card not present channel in a fairly secure manner, in addition to the expanded adoption of secure technologies like tokenization and contactless. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, well, if we manage to kind of weather the storm of the pandemic and fight back these fairly sophisticated, innovative fraudsters, do we really need to be in this session to learn how to manage risk during a digital transformation? It seems like we're doing a really good job already. And that's a totally fair point. I definitely want you to stay in your seats, because the second part of the story is really around kind of this component of consumer behavior that we hadn't talked about, which is the fraud rate did decrease overall, and it was certainly driven by kind of these proactive changes that we'd made. Another part was also really due to the shift in the channel mix, where folks started to spend a lot more money domestically, which tends to be more secure ways to pay versus going cross-border and spending money internationally, which tend to be less secure transactions. And so if the transaction mix between domestic and cross-border returns to its pre-COVID ratio, we would actually expect the fraud rate to increase by 4%. And given that kind of internationally there are the beginnings of a return to normalcy as vaccinations become more prevalent and people start to travel internationally more, that shift will kind of play out. And on top of that, you'll have kind of some of these fraud vectors that we had discussed really acting as a tailwind for increasing the amount of fraudulent activity that's occurring in the ecosystem. So we really have to be very proactive to ensure that that security foundation that we have put in place kind of continue the acceleration of the digital transformation is there, and it kind of maintain the trust of our consumers in the services that we provide. And kind of the other kind of factors to consider is that a lot of firms generally don't feel like they can execute on their risk management priorities. In that same study that we did with Forrester, you could see that the two most critical kind of priorities from a risk management perspective around protecting sensitive data and keeping up with some of these emerging risks that we had discussed, only about a third of organizations feel like they are very prepared to do so. And that's a somewhat of a concerning number. You would want it to be in the 80s, 90s for you to feel comfortable. And so what we really have here is kind of these confluence of events. We have a pandemic-led acceleration of digitized consumer experiences and transactions. You have increasingly sophisticated, organized, funded fraudsters that are kind of taking advantage of the vulnerabilities in these newly digitized consumer interactions. And then you have firms who don't feel like they are prepared to deal with these evolving risk management landscape and kind of absent this kind of proactive, coordinated action. It's really going to be a bit of a challenge to kind of maintaining this pace of digital transformation that we had seen over the last 12 months. And so the key around that is really how do we kind of consider risk management on a holistic level and think about these three ways that we can manage risk holistically through that digital transformation. And the first one is really around kind of thinking about what your ultimate end goal is and really refining that strategy, then kind of pointing your technology investments in order for you to promote and further that strategy. And then finally, coming with a governance structure that allows you to kind of execute on the strategy and realize the benefits of your technology investment. So I'll go through each one in a little bit more detail. And so the first piece is around strategy. An incredibly overused word, almost as overused as unprecedented, but at its core, in my mind, is really a roadmap for you to achieve your goal. And the first part of what I think is important when it comes to strategy development, especially within a risk context, is that risk organizations tend to build their strategies in a fairly siloed way. So the business has a strategy, and then the risk team is over here kind of doing their own thing, and they don't really meet in the middle unless something goes terribly wrong. So the first part, I think, is just really thinking what is the overall organization's approach and goals, and then how does the risk strategy that you're building actually help promote and further those goals. So kind of think about, as an example, the overall company's goal is to deliver a seamless consumer experience. Taking a risk lens to it, it kind of breaks it down to, well, I want to make sure that every legitimate transaction for my customer is approved, and I want to make sure that every fraudulent transaction for my cardholder is declined. And then from there, having that as your organizational North Star, you have this set of inputs that I've outlined here, thinking about what are your competitors doing, how are regulators thinking about kind of these types of consumer experiences, and this, this example, authentication. How does something like an SCA in Europe apply to it? Looking at your consumers and how their behavior is changing and some of the ways that we'd outlined at the beginning of this presentation. And from there, really coming out with a holistic picture about what are the key drivers that are going to either help you meet that objective or are going to be an obstacle, and which ones are going to be kind of the most impactful, either positively or negatively. Again, the other kind of key thing to remember, our strategy is about making choices. You can't kind of have everything. You have to think about what's the best allocation of your assets is going to be. And then out of that, let's say, kind of prioritization exercise, you come out with 3 to 5 key strategic initiatives that you want to really focus on and dedicate yourselves to so that you can meet your objective goal. Once you have kind of those, again, 3 to 5 key objectives in mind, then the next part is really about aligning your technology transformation to further those objectives along. And I think this piece here is really important because kind of what we've noticed is that traditionally, we're very fond of kind of building these point solutions to deal with specific problems. So, 18 months ago, ATM cash outs were a huge deal, so we'll build a solution and then kind of resolve that issue. And today, account enumeration, for instance, is a big deal, so we'll build a point solution and figure that out. But 18 from now, it's going to be a different fraud vector. And so the idea is really, how do you enable yourself to have a flexible tech architecture that allows you to be much more responsive and much more agile to these new emerging fraud vectors, so that you're not always kind of chasing the rabbit. And I think you do that through these three core capabilities or pieces. The first part of it is really foundational. It's your actual infrastructure, your technological infrastructure. And I'm just highlighting kind of four pieces here. From a computing capacity, if your risk analyst runs the query and then they have to come back in the morning to find out the outcome of that query, it probably means you don't have enough computing capacity and you need to expand that to handle kind of the additional data that you have. You need to kind of take a look at the data sources that you have available to you, both in-house through your different systems or through some of the different acquisitions that you have made, and kind of normalize that so you have a single view of how the transaction hits throughout the life cycle, as well as think about what are some third party data that you can use to enrich your existing data set so that you can further refine your models. And that's where analysis velocity comes in. Again, your ability to make really quick decisions based on numerous amounts of kind of experiments to hone in on the key data elements that are going to give you the best, most optimized outcome. And a big part of that, of course, is going to be around the algorithms that you're running through your AI and machine learning capability, making sure that you have kind of the right data, that you are training the models in the right way and getting optimized outcomes so that you now have the tools to build the capabilities that come in that next layer where you're digesting this data and processing it correctly. You're able to build fairly flexible rule model engines so that you're not building a point solution to solve for a specific fraud type, but rather you can kind of relatively deploy these models in a much more flexible, much more agile way that would then allow you to prioritize what alerts you want to be automatically handled, either kind of ignored or actioned, and which alerts you want an actual live human being to go and analyze and determine what action should be followed up next, and then see that end-to-end case management flow so that based on the outcome of these alerts, you're feeding that back into the algorithm to improve it and allow it to learn better so that your outcomes are becoming much more targeted over time. And then finally, kind of thinking about, well, how do you output that to your ultimate end user in a way that provides them with the right information at the right time and is easier for them to digest. And once you have these capabilities, you have these building blocks together, you can start to deploy them in ways to automate your really core processes. And I've used kind of three examples here of types of risks that I think every organization manages in one way or the other. Where now, for instance, if you're dealing with fraud risk, going back to the earlier point, you're seeing this new kind of fraud pattern emerge, you're isolating those transactions, you're seeing the pattern that they follow, you're implementing rules that detect for those transactions in your larger data set, and then you're deploying it so that your ability to manage these new incidents is much more automated and much more efficient than it would be if you had actual human beings doing it, and if you actually had to build a new capability from the ground up to be able to action these new vectors. And so we're seeing that really kind of across the different risk types that we are managing. So really thinking about what are the core outcomes that we're trying to achieve, what are the processes that are supporting them, and how can we make these processes more automated and more efficient because we have built that technology foundation to begin with. And then finally, there's kind of the third piece of managing risk and digital transformation, which is really all around governance. Kind of one of the interesting findings that we had in that study with Forrester is that most organizations are investing more in their technologies when it comes to risk management, whether that's next-gen capabilities or it's analytics or kind of automation tools. And yet, as you saw, there's still a pretty significant portion of them that feel like they're not able to deliver on their key priorities. And I think a key part of the disconnect is we tend to overinvest in tools and underinvest in people and in processes and in governance. And I think that's usually one of the missing pieces. And so what we want to really emphasize is for me at least, governance is really around how do you take a consistent set of standards and processes that allows you to align people across different functions, across even different organizations, so that you're pursuing a common goal or a common path. And what I've focused on here is really the ability to distribute the intelligence and the analytics that you were able to derive from your technology transformation to the right stakeholders so that they can action it and turn those insights into actual performance. And so the way that you work with your clients, share that information, the analytics, the benchmarking, the best practices, so that they're acting as a first line of defense. How do you get together with ecosystem partners to think through kind of coordinated efforts to reduce and mitigate fraud in the kind of in your shared marketplace? Internally, within your own functional teams, how can you provide the information necessary for them to make business decisions that optimize the trade-off between risk and reward? And then within your risk teams that are distributed around the world, how do you work with them to localize the insights and the inputs through their respective market environments so that they are benefiting from the global scale, but they're able to tailor that to their unique market? So taking this holistic approach, combining the strategy, the technology, and the governance to make sure you have a solid risk management foundation is going to be really critical during this time of transition as we're kind of moving from the COVID pandemic to what comes next, and seeing how this consumer behavior that we had seen during the pandemic stabilizes and reaches a new normal equilibrium. And I think one of the key highlights here around a risk management strategy is that you're not doing for the sake of just checking the box or to kind of make your auditors happy or to make your regulators happy. The ultimate goal of this approach is positive business outcomes. If you are able to have this holistic risk management framework in place, you're less likely to have operational failures that increase your operating costs. You're more likely to have higher loyalty and higher client stickiness with your customers. And that ultimately will drive higher profits for you and improve profitability for your organization. So the key when designing these pieces is to always think about the ultimate business outcome that you're driving towards. And so for the last section of the presentation, what I really want to do is kind of give you a high level, let's say, checklist of some of the things that you can take back to your respective organizations and just measure yourself against and see on a scale of 1 to 10, how strong do you believe you're covered for some of these dimensions that I'll go through. And then for areas where you think you could do a double click, kind of think about how do you incorporate this into your future roadmap. And so the first section I want to talk about is really thinking through your customers specifically. And I think a lot of times we think about the customer experience in a very disjointed manner versus kind of an end-to-end manner. You think about the authentication side is handled by a different side of the house than the folks who are managing risk. But for me, you really have to think through kind of what is that risk reward with this customer interaction and make that decision holistically versus just trying to optimize for one metric over the other. Another is also empowering them with tools so that they can fight fraud more proactively. I think customers today are increasingly getting in a whole host of new financial relationships with their providers, and they want a sense of control. And so if you give them tools like alerts and kind of transaction controls, they're more likely to kind of remain loyal to you. And we've actually seen fraud alerts do significant work in reducing the overall fraud amount with some of the customer accounts up to 30% in a recent study that we did. And then finally, kind of think about ensuring that trust is a key part of your value proposition externally. So Visa itself has done kind of campaigns where we just highlighted the security features of our products, and we actually saw a sustainable increase not only in the usage of our payment products, but also in the activation of them as well. The second is really around investing in technology and people. And again, we spend a lot of time talking about the technology transformation, but again, as the kind of the fraud landscape evolves, the way that we tackle it has to evolve. One kind of specific call out again is really around continuing to invest in analytics and data. We've been using AI models to really manage this turbulent time and ensuring that as we've seen kind of these increases in illicit transactions, we're able to decline the fraudulent ones, but keep the legitimate transactions going through to make sure that we're managing consumer expectations correctly, as well as investing in your people so that you have security experts that can help you manage this transition. We did something similar where we've built a risk operations center that we refer to as the ROC colloquially, and they combine this deep knowledge of fairly sophisticated statistical models with these fraud techniques, and they're able to intervene at the right time with the right tools to minimize fraud before it even impacts our clients. In the last year alone, they actually stopped about $3.5 billion worth of fraudulent PV that saved our clients just a tremendous amount in terms of operating and customer costs. The third is really around kind of, again, going back to the concept of strong governance. How do you think about kind of processes that reinforce your strategy and reinforce the ultimate endpoint that you're trying to get to? One is around dedicating time and resources to make sure that your people are educated on the latest and greatest of what's happening in the fraud landscape. Working collaboratively with industry bodies to innovate at scale. I think the things that we've done through EMV, for instance, are a great example of what can happen when we collaborate to stamp out fraud, with the adoption of EMV chip that has significantly decreased card-present fraud. And then finally, just making sure that there are documented repeatable processes for managing changes to what you enhance and making sure that your products are built secure from the start to kind of reduce the incidence of vulnerabilities that could be exploited by the ever clever fraudsters. And then finally, kind of thinking about that North Star, which is your strategy, which should be ever evolving, kind of thinking about those strategic frameworks that you will leverage to make sure that your resources are being allocated in the most efficient way, and kind of how do you address some of the potential gaps that you have in your existing capabilities when you compare them to the trends that are shaping the landscape where you operate. Using these forums, these industry forums where you can learn and share ideas and gather feedback. I'm very much looking forward to a whole host of other sessions during the conference that I think will really inform my strategic thinking. So definitely take advantage of that. And then being able to kind of distill all that information in a clear to understand roadmap that shows you, your organization, and your key external stakeholders where you think the landscape is headed and what you're doing to keep ahead of it. I think that kind of builds not only commitment, but accountability to make sure that we're all moving in the right direction. And then finally, some even more concrete terms or some more concrete recommendations that I wanted to share, kind of quick wins that you can do right after this session is over. I think these are fairly straightforward and most likely obvious to a lot of us, but it's always a good reminder. It's always a good hygiene to keep in mind. And the only one that I'll kind of explicitly call out is just our Risk Operations Center, the ROC as we call it. So always give us a call when you think that there are threats or attacks that you're facing, and we'll be more than happy to provide assistance and support. And so, as we like to say, let's work together to rock the fraud world. And with that, I want to thank you for your time and for your attention. And please feel free to continue sending questions through the chat as I answer them.